Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. We have a bit of a different format for you this week. We have a recording that I did with the president of Arcos Global Advisors, Cale Dowell, as a follow-up to an event we hosted at Hobby Lobby for about 50 generous business owners to hear David Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby, tell his story about founding the company and the struggles they had with figuring out how to do the legacy planning of who would run the business long term. And as you'll hear, he made some mistakes that he's since corrected. You may have heard this story, but from those 50 generous business owners in attendance, they had a lot of questions. What are other people like me doing? So we put together a follow-up webinar where I do some content and I interview Cale for some content around 3 questions you can ask to figure out, how you should structure your sort of personal finances and in your business, perhaps. And then a framework for estate planning we also go through. And then the third thing we go through is I kind of ask Cale, what are the top 5 questions generous business owners have asked us over the years, those of us in the wealth management business. And we kind of kick around those. We talk about biblical principles and some other ideas for you. So if you're wondering, what are other people like me doing in terms of structuring their estate and handling their business and other financial matters, I hope you'll enjoy this webinar. Thanks, folks. Take you through the format, and then I'm going to kind of ask Cale to introduce these 5 questions, and then we'll kind of go back and forth as a discussion to talk about those things. So without further ado, and Cale's doing the slide. So Cale, let's go to the next slide and let's show them these kind of 3 key questions that we try to ask folks to get the juices flowing in maybe a different way. I would say these are not the top 3, Cale, that are on the estate planning questionnaire. Not to throw the estate planning attorneys under the bus, but we think these come maybe even before you should show up to the attorney. So here are these 3 questions. And we would say, we just want to kind of introduce these. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it. You'll kind of see through this webinar how we kind of deal with some of that and how others have dealt with this. But we'd love for you to just write these 3 down. And if you're married, talk to your spouse about these. They're not easy questions to answer. And ask the owner, which we consider to be God, of course, how he would answer this. So you ask the owner. If you're a steward, not an owner, ask God these 3 questions. How much is enough for us? In other words, sort of a financial finish line. How much is enough for the kids? And what do I do with the rest? So let's just go through them one more time. Maybe write them down. How much is enough for us? How much is enough for the kids? And if there's a delta, what do we do with the rest? Not easy questions. And of course, in our society, how much is enough? What do you mean? A little more, right, Cale? A little more.
Right.
Person with the most toys wins. So if we're coming from a different perspective, a biblical perspective, we think God keeps score differently. Yeah. So what does he allow us to keep? So maybe instead of this idea of what do we give to God, if we come from the place of, do we give God a tithe of 10% of what we own? Or does he let us keep what percent of what he owns? A little different perspective. And the kid thing, boy, we'll get into that later, but that's a question that a lot of parents and grandparents struggle with. And we'll talk about that later, but that's a tough one to answer. And then what do I do with the rest? If I got excess that's been identified, what should I do with it? So Yeah, let's go to the next thing. Let's go to the framework. So that's just kind of part one. We want you to write those down. We know you're not going to answer that. You're not going to answer that necessarily in the next hour or so that we're doing this. But that's your homework. Go ahead, Cale.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add in there before we go to the next slide is the importance of, like, everyone has to answer these questions at some point. When you get to the end, you'll have consumed what you consumed, and maybe it was every penny, for right or for wrong reasons. If there's excess, there's chances you're going to leave some or something or maybe nothing to kids or other beneficiaries. And if there's excess from that, then what do I do with it? So the exciting part, though, of these questions is if you can answer the first two and there's still excess, that can be a really fruitful place to start thinking about stewardship and impact. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that maybe tees up, Jeff, to your point, a framework that we utilize to help people think through kind of the estate plan and how it can help begin a conversation and answering some of these questions. So with that, we'll go to the next slide.
Okay, so this presentation basically came out of a need we have after advising clients for decades. And seeing this, we found that people were very uncomfortable. It's not like we were talking them into doing anything different. They kind of did this sort of standard estate plan where you just divide your net worth by the number of kids and grandkids and distribute it, and that takes care of it. And maybe you buy insurance for the rest. There's just some kind of holy simmering discontent. And so we were looking for a way years ago to sort of explain a different framework. So we're going to kind of show you, hopefully in plain English. We're not trying to beat you up with too many slides. I don't like a lot of busy slides, but we're going to just try to run you through this framework. So let's go to the next one. This is what we would say is kind of we'll call this the world's estate plan or the traditional estate plan. And we're just going to pick $100 million. Frankly, you got to answer these questions if you got $1 million. But it's just more complicated at 100 million because you're over the threshold of in this case, it says 27.2 million that you can pass on to the kids. And that gets adjusted each year for inflation. So I'm just going to say it's, roughly 30 million bucks that you can pass on to the next generation without estate taxes. So in a traditional plan, and again, we're trying to keep this simple. Let's say you got a total net worth of 100 million bucks, and you answer these three questions. Remember, how much is enough for you? Let's say the answer to that is essentially 30 million bucks. And the answer to how much is enough for the kids, also 30 million. Let's say you got 3 kids, it's 10 million. That's a big assumption. It might be a lot less than that or a lot more than that. That's between you and God. But just as an illustration, we just want to show people this is kind of a template that most people get sort of jammed into before they ask those questions. So roughly 30 million on here, it's 27.2, goes to the kids. The remainable taxable estate, 72.8. That gets taxed at about 45%. And normally what happens, so there's, see 29.1 million, essentially $30 million of estate tax gets paid. And what would happen a lot is people would come in with this kind of net worth or a taxable estate, and we'd always ask them, what are you going to pay in estate taxes when you die? And they sort of look at the ceiling and they go, well, I think it's zero. And I'm like, you get 100 million bucks. It's not zero. And when we would sort of unpack this, they go, oh yeah, that's right. We have an insurance policy that pays. But so the tax is being paid. It's just usually set up in a trust that owns insurance, second to die, that pays the tax. But make no mistake, 30 million bucks roughly is going to the US government. And most people, if they're shown an alternative, maybe one of our principles is to disinherit the IRS. So our goal would be to eliminate that number if it fits with those three questions being answered. And so the sort of standard plan is, you got this insurance policy that can be very expensive, by the way. And that pays the insurance and the kids get all 100 million. And, maybe we didn't put this on there, but maybe on page 3 of the estate planning questionnaire, there's a little something about charitable giving and you tip the church and a couple of nonprofits. But generally, this is how it's done. So we kind of call this, on this slide, it says the traditional estate plan. I like to call it the world's template, the world's estate plan. Let's rethink that and go to the next one real quick, Cale. So this is what we would kind of call, on the slide, it says the generosity focused estate plan. Sometimes we call it the kingdom estate plan. And let's say that you answered this question saying, hey, 30 million's enough for us, enough for the kids. There's essentially 70 million remaining. Okay, the 30 goes to the kids. What you could do, and look, we're not trying to prescribe this, but if you don't want to pay anything to the IRS, actually the US tax code is unbelievably generous to generous people. So, for example, and again, this is just a simple idea. We're not prescribing that 30 million is what your finish line or for the kids. But if it is, why would you give them the 100 million we showed in the first example? You could limit, kind of set your own finish line and the kids. And the remainder is, almost 70 million bucks there, 72.8 you see in the slide. And you could just give all of that to charity. You could do it today, or you could do it at your death, but we think it's really not that much fun to do it at your death. You don't get the fun of giving it away. You don't get to really do it with your family, for example, or your employees, or a combination, or with a foundation, or however you might do that. There's a million ways to give it away. You can give it away all at once. You can give it away in pieces. But we think that, maybe having a family involved in giving, whether it's that number or something smaller or something bigger, that tends to lead to thriving families. And our goal is to have, connect your money with your purpose and help families thrive across generations. We think a family that's involved in giving and thinking of others rather than consumption for themselves tends to lead to a healthier, thriving family. So there's a million ways to skin that cat. In terms of there are also, this is something that, we'll tell some other stories about Alan Barnhart and people who have essentially done this even a more radical way, where, guys like Alan are, living on $100,000 and giving away, hundreds of millions of dollars in value in their business. You don't have to give it all away in the business. There are other people like Pete Oakes, who has taken sort of the Purpose Trust, made famous, only been around for a few years in America, where the beneficiary can be a cause. So in Patagonia's case, it's the environment. And in Pete Oakes' case, it's the kingdom. Okay, so generosity to charitable causes, Christ-centered charitable causes. And you can have different owners in there. So we could probably talk about that later. My guess is we'll have a question, something about that, and we can get deeper into that. But we often have people come to our offices and ask, they have a tactical question, and that's what we'll get into next, is what are those tactical questions they usually ask. And when they ask those tactical questions, we usually say, great question, we'll answer it. Tap pause, let's back up, hear the whole story. And then after hearing the whole story, usually the kind of plan that God's leading these families into, maybe yours, is somewhere between that world plan where there's essentially zero generosity and, something like this, where 70% goes. Maybe it's 99%, maybe it's 10%, but likely there's something more than just a tiny amount. So anyway, we just want to give a framework. And a lot of times when people see this, they're like, oh, okay, that's the kind of question I was thinking. I just didn't know how to voice it. Sort of a discomfort with those things. Anything you would add before we go to the key questions?
Yeah, I think one thing I just want to make the connection to is, the original, the traditional estate plan that you're seeing on your screen here. Basically this is a good proxy for kind of the advice, the original advice. For those of you that were at the David Green event, this is kind of the advice he received from like-minded, advisors. But it's kind of the advice of the day, which Again, depending on what your unique calling is that God has placed on your life, might be the right plan. For David, it was the wrong financial structure, the wrong estate structure that was prohibiting or preventing the unique calling that God had placed not just on David, but ultimately his family. So he had a good estate plan to avoid taxes and to get wealth off his balance sheet and into the hands of the next generations and do that with the business, etc. But it was prohibiting that unique calling. So his ultimate estate plan doesn't look like the exactly like the generosity focused estate plan, but this type of thinking, this opportunity to think outside the bonds or the bounds of kind of the traditional minded estate plan led him on a journey to figure out what else was possible and ultimately craft a design that was conducive to God's unique calling on their life. And so, in the first model, in that kind of traditional model, as Jeff kind of alluded to, it's all about, we call it dump, divide, dissipate. So, get it off my balance sheet into the hands of the next generation, dissipate it, and then how am I going to dissipate it to the kids? So let's avoid paying taxes, and then maybe we'll tip the church. So we've got charitable giving at zero, but maybe that's the, you got $100 million. I'll tip the church $100,000 at the end or something like that. But it's usually predicated on, a planned giving idea. Well, I'll do it after I die, which can be a useful estate planning tool if that's the direction God's leading and calling you. But this other model, and again, we kind of did it simplistically, that's more focused on, answering those three questions. How much is enough for us? How much is enough for the kids? And in that model, as Jeff said, if enough was about 30 million, wow, the impact goes up by 70 million. And by the way, you still don't have to pay taxes, and you don't have to pay for the pricey insurance policy. So again, the idea here is that this framework of thinking provides some opportunity to think beyond the traditional estate plan. It doesn't have to look like everyone else's. And there are other people out there like the Greens and others that Jeff mentioned that have found a unique custom model that not only enhances generosity and kingdom impact, but also provides opportunity to have a more conducive alignment between kind of the family structure and the financial structure. And that's kind of the purpose of this exercise. So we're
just trying to match that sort of family structure with the financial structure,
Exactly. So with that might be a good segue into, what are the questions?
Let me say one other thing, Cale. A couple of resources on the Generous Business Owner podcast. If you haven't seen that, just type it into your favorite podcast, player. Just type in Generous Business and it'll pop up. But it's a podcast. We've done a couple of hundred of these interviews with people, including Pete Oakes, who's done that Purpose Trust, and he walks you through that trust and how that works. And also we've done interviews with Alan Barnhart where he gave the whole company away. So in Pete's case, he's got different constituents. Family members own some charity owns some, but it's eliminated the estate tax by putting it in this trust. So we got the IRS out of it, and it's got a combination of family ownership, maybe even some employee ownership, and charitable ownership. So if you want a combination, maybe listen to that one as an example, or if you just want to give the whole thing away, we call that the Barnhart, the Oaks example and the Barnhart example. Anyway, both of those podcasts are available in the Generous Business Owner. Just search for Alan Barnhart or Pete Oakes, Ochs. All right, let's go to the questions.
All right, so these are generally questions that get asked as a function, not just of this conversation, but of generous business owners that are trying to figure out, they've got kind of the seated discomfort. But as Jeff said, they often come in with some sort of tactical question, and that question leads to a much bigger conversation. So this is kind of the entry point, and maybe these are questions you've thought about or you're thinking through, or maybe this will spark a question you haven't thought about. But these are kind of the top 5 questions that we tend to get asked. So we'll start with number 5. Jeff, I'll let you take it away. Number 5.
All right. And so Cale and I originally did this presentation, and we were trying to think about the way we think about this. We sort of identified 7 gaps. Our team's kind of identified 7 gaps where generous business owners, it seems like all these questions we've gotten from thousands of these people that we've met with tend to fall into these 7. And so we just picked the top 5, kind of David Letterman style. I know I'm dating myself with that reference, but he used to do top 10 lists, and we probably don't have time for 10 or even 7, but we'll do the top 5 and get us started. So, all right, without further ado, Cale, what is number 5?
Number 5 is just, can you help me get organized? Which we've got kind of a funny translation here on the same page of what this tends to actually mean. One of our principles, and if for those of y'all that were at the David Green thing might remember, on the side of his giant warehouse it says keep it simple. And one of our principles is simplicity wins. And so as the balance sheet ticks up, things tend to get a lot more complicated. Maybe you've got a gazillion K1s, you've got the business, you've got kids. We're trying to think through the estate. How do we navigate next gen? There's all these, generosity, man, everyone, somehow there's a button got hit. Everyone knows we're rich now. So we're fielding requests, and do we start the foundation? There's all these things. So can you help me get it organized is kind of born out of this. Things are not so simple. And often where that leads to is some sort of, maybe it's not a disagreement, but it's that I'm not on the same page as my spouse. Either my spouse doesn't know what's going on because I've been trying to keep just the boat afloat with all this, and I'm trying to make it simple on her. So for right or wrong reasons, she's kind of been out of the picture, or there's maybe continued conversation around a specific piece of that organization that you're just not seeing eye to eye. So that can lead to a lot of potential to not make progress on some of these gaps that Jeff alluded to. So a verse that we have that goes with that comes from Proverbs 15:22. I think I've got it on the screen here. Yeah. Which says, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. And one of the things we know happens is as the balance sheet ticks up, not only do the complications and challenges and all that stuff, and things tend to they get more complex, and there becomes this desire to keep things more simple. But also what happens is there's an isolation of sorts that tends to happen where I don't know who to talk to. I don't know who to trust. I don't know other people like me. That was one of the things, common reactions in the room. For those of us in Oklahoma City, there were a lot of people that found a breath of fresh air from meeting like-minded people that are navigating similar situations, trying to be more generous, trying to have more kingdom impact, trying to rethink whether that's the way they do their estate, their investments, the family. And it was kind of a breath of fresh air to, there's other people like me. And so I think there's a value in that sense of both community and having like-minded advisors with the experience and the know-how to help you write out whatever that plan, that God-given plan is on your heart. And clearly, the Greens, as an example, it's not that they had bad advisors originally. They had good advisors that had experience, but they didn't have experience on going where God was calling them. And ultimately, he found the right people. And you met a key one, Bill High, who led a lot of that conversation with David, that helped them navigate a lot of that family structure. And then, of course, they married that with the right financial structure, and that helped them kind of press into that unique purpose. But it all started with trying to keep things simple, making sure they had the right people around them, and writing down what that plan is. So, Jeff, any stories that you might share about that?
I'll share one, and then there was one that you've been involved in, both of us recently. Maybe a negative story and a positive story, because I don't know about you guys, but I probably unfortunately learned more in the tough times than the good times. And but probably, 15 years ago, at least, I had a client in the wealth management business. It was a guy that I worked with at a accounting firm right out of college, and his business had kind of taken off later in life. So he had some small accounts with us early. He lived kind of outside of Houston in a rural area. and had 5 kids and his wife, and they lived out there. And every year he'd come in, and our team would update a financial plan for him. And every year we'd say, "Well, boy, it'd be great if you'd bring your wife in. We'd really like to meet her and make sure you guys are on the same page." He's like, "Man, we live so far away. I already work in the city. It's easier for me to kind of just meet with you. I'm, kind of filling her in," and it always made us a little uncomfortable. And I'll be darned if some years later, tragically, God took him home with a massive heart attack in the middle of the night at age 47. And I'll never forget his wife finally showing up, right? Because now she's got to deal with all this financial stuff. And walking down the hall, it was a long hallway. I'll never forget it. I remember seeing her round the corner with her brother, who I also didn't know. And we locked eyes, and I knew who she was, but she knew who I was, but she did not know me or really the plan. The truth is, I'm sure he came home and had maybe a high level discussion, but she obviously was in mourning, in pain, and frankly, even though the X's and O's were set up right, she was in a good financial position. Our team was not able to be the blessing that we would have loved to be to her, to comfort her as people that she knows and already trusts. And I'll never forget that as long as I live, as a missed opportunity to be a blessing. And I believe, and of course, in 99 out of 100 cases, we do get them both there. And it's not like that. That's why it stood out to me so starkly, is in most cases, we were able to be a blessing. And so a lot, for a lot of folks that have been financially successful, many of them are very good at finances inside their business. Maybe they don't love or have time to deal with the personal finances, but many of them are capable. There's often one person in the relationship, at least sometimes two, that are capable of handling the finances. So one of the things that kind of plays into this question, I think, is also, if something happens to me, whoever the most financial savvy or whoever is most interested, what happens to my spouse? And so that's one thing, is having this written plan where both parties are part of it. I think it does two things. It gets you on the same page while you're alive, but it also sets the person up that's left behind, because there's always going to be one. There's always going to be somebody left behind. And often it's the female, and in a lot of cases it's the guy that's more interested in finance. Not all the time, but you don't want to leave whoever's less into it in the dark when they're in the most pain. Maybe they've been in their life. So that's one thing. The other thing is the benefit of being on the same page while you're alive. That actually has its own set of benefits. And Cale, why don't you talk about that business owner we recently met with that are still maybe in their late 30s or around 40, and they came in.
Probably early 40s. And again, I mean, they kind of came in with this same question, is like, we kind of, business is starting to S curve, which is exciting. At the same time, there's some, inheritance money that's kind of being doled out, but not without any rhyme or reason. And so it's just kind of like falling in laps. And, what do we do? Stuff's kind of strewn everywhere. Business is going well. Like, we've got young kids, just all those questions. And so what they really need is a written plan. But there was also this kind of, maybe initial desire for, like, what do we do? And as they accrue some cash, well, do we diversify out of the business? Do we just double down on what we got? I mean, there's all these questions, and they just need both kind of a trusted place to have those conversations, and maybe some examples of other people like them that have navigated a similar situation that leads to a conversation about having that written plan and getting kind of clear on both, near term and long term kind of purpose, and so that simplicity can happen, and that simplicity can lead to progress along kind of a desired outcome and with that plan. So again, that verse is such a good one. It's relevant for all aspects of our lives, but not the least of which is this, which is, without counsel, a plan will fail. but with many advisors, they will succeed. So make sure, I guess the takeaway here is it's not uncommon for you to feel challenged with kind of stuff strewn everywhere. Very common with a lot of business owners. And it's also very common for spouses not to be on the same page about all this for a variety of different reasons. Also not uncommon for there to be not be some semblance of a written plan or conjoined purpose around, let's call it the personal balance sheet. Those things are very good things to work on. And one of the reasons is probably one of the most asked questions.
Let me just say the one thing as a good description, Cale, that the one thing I would add is in many cases, and in the case that you're talking about, the tension between both, in this case, both members of the couple are in the business, but the husband's really leading it. And I think he would take every nickel forever and put it in the business. And sometimes, at a certain point in life, it might be good to, if the other spouse is not comfortable with that, to maybe have a written plan that where we don't have an argument with every dollar of distribution where it goes. So kind of what buckets get created and that kind of thing. And often it's helpful to have some counsel around that. So anyway, I think that's. Are we good on that one? Should we go to number 4?
Let's go to number 4. So number 4, take it away, Jeff.
Okay, so I'm just going to do the intro. You say it. Do we need a drum roll? I mean, I feel like we don't have enough sound
I
effects
don't
in
know if
this
this will show up in
webinar.
the microphone here. But
Okay, so drum roll, please. Number 4, Cale, what is the 4th most popular question that we get from generous business owners?
how much do we need?
And what are they actually saying?
Yeah, no surprise here. Common question. What they're actually saying is we don't have a financial finish line, which, by the way, 8 times out of 10, that's probably not even a term that they've heard. But suffice it to say, they don't know how much they need. They're maybe uncomfortable with how much they have, and they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And they don't have the language necessarily on a financial finish line, but a lot of times that's where the conversation can lead is what might that financial finish line look like for us? And so one of the principles that we espouse is steward, not owner. And of course, that we've probably heard that a lot if you've gone to church or been to events like the one we did with David Green. Is how do you be a steward, not owner? God owns it all, so we're just the steward. He's the owner. But a verse that goes with that is Psalm 24:1, which says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." So if that's really true, everything comes from God, then He's the source, and everything that we has is just a resource He has provided us to steward. So if we could start with that operating principle, it will help us define or begin conversations about, well, how much do we need? So I'll pause there. Jeff, any stories you'll share about this kind of question, what it means, and maybe the principle?
Yeah, and I think this is the core. A lot of times, the way this manifests itself in, again, you'll remember the first 3 questions: how much enough for you, how much enough for the kids, and what do you do with the rest? Those are not questions people come in asking us.
Yeah.
Those are questions we tend to challenge others with that they haven't been challenged with before. But now we're in these questions where these are versions of what we hear. And often, one of the places we hear this the most is when people are thinking about transitioning the business, either to the next generation, to their employees, or to a third party selling it. And they might get a note, they might just sell it outright. And they're usually saying, I've just always taken money out of the business. If I don't get a paycheck from the business, or not as large of one as I used to, where's it going to come from? Okay. And there are all these, I'll give you a little tip. There are all these, I always say every year they mint a bunch of new PhDs in finance. Okay. And many of them write a thesis around roughly the same topic, which is how much can you spend in retirement without running out of money? Okay. And the number tends to be around 4, maybe 5%. Use 4%. If something grows by 7%, think about an endowment for the university you went to, okay? If they get 7%, they have a spending policy of 4%, it just grows by inflation every year and they keep spending more. Now you'll have a pile at the end, right? They're not depleting it. If you want to deplete it, maybe it's a higher number than 4, but it's something like that. So, you know, if you're spending $1 million a year, you probably need 25 million, let's say, or if you get $1 million of income, 25 million of an endowment to sort of endow that. But again, in our $100 million example, that still leaves 75. So, people tend to come in asking this question, and we kind of want to turn it around on them a little bit to just think about, okay, think about a finish line, because they just haven't done the math. And a lot of times the business is worth more than what they need, or God is telling them they can use. And so what do you do with that delta? So anyway, a common question that we get, and I'll say this, how much you need, can vary. Whenever remember I told that Barnhart story in the beginning, and he helps us out with a generous business owner movement. And of course, I told you his podcast is on there as well, where we interviewed him. And he tells the whole story if you haven't heard it. But, when he got out of college, he was getting married, and his wife wanted to go to the mission field. He wanted to take over the fledgling family business. They had 2 cranes that his parents ran, and he and his brother wanted to kind of take over the family business and grow the business. And so he made a compromise with his wife that they would set their salary right out of college at what the mission board would pay them. And if they made more than that in business, because they'd go ahead and take over the business, they'd give that away. And so that first year they gave away 50,000, and now it's tens of millions of dollars a year, and they still cap their lifestyle at about 100,000 a year. That's a very radical story. Most of you running businesses you're not going back there. That's coming out of college before your lifestyle crept. So we use that as an illustration. Hey, maybe God is calling you to that. Maybe, especially if you're younger listening to this, maybe that's something you want to try. It's a model we're kind of following at Arcos in terms of giving away the company, but the finish line is a little different. But that is kind of one idea. I always back that, but that's such a radical story and frankly unrelatable to many people. I think it's helpful for inspiration. But many older people that are already running businesses, that ship has sailed. So I always like to tell, another podcast guest we had was Tim Sidema out of South Carolina, a real estate developer. And, when he tells his story, his calling from God is to build low-income housing. So he's a real estate developer. He's good at that. But, his normal partners are not as excited about the low returns that this kind of housing does. This is a charitable thing that he likes to do, but he needs a big balance sheet to finance it. Okay, so we kind of call this the tale of 2 barns. In the Bible they talk about 2 situations where there are barns being built to store excess. Right? In one, it's a guy who just wants to sell everything, retire, and store everything up, and of course God says, "You fool." You're to use it for a better purpose, not just to sit back and relax. Of course, you remember the story of Joseph, who built barns with excess because God told him that the people would need it during a famine. So it's not about the balance sheet or the barn. It's about, what is God's purpose? What is he telling you to do? So this is just a very personal question that only God can answer to you and your spouse if you're married. What does that financial finish line look like?
Yeah.
But anyway, we just want to put this in language that you're likely to sort of recognize, and then to kind of turn it around to how do we kind of solve that?
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful. Cale, what other thoughts you have?
Yeah, I mean, mathematically, as you alluded to, it's actually not that challenging to answer the question mathematically, because we could just, start dreaming or use the endowment model, whatever, and you can back into a number, and that might be a place to start. But more importantly, there's the heart conversation. Well, what was God telling me? Ultimately, that's the place we hope people end up, and whatever number that is, big or small. And, but these things flow together. It's hard to define that if you don't have some semblance of a written plan. If you can have that written plan and that core purpose, that will help define whatever that financial finish line might be. But again, it all starts with that principle, which is if God really owns it all and we're just the steward of his resources, anything we get to keep is a gift. So how do we both honor and bless God in recognition of how he's blessed us? I think that is the interesting conversation that no one can prescribe to you, but when you seek it out and start acting on it, I do know the people that we know that have gone through that exercise, whether it's guys like Tim or guys like Barnhart. There's different variations in how it gets executed, but they tend to be people that you can see an abundant life with. So moving on. Number 3, Jeff, back to you.
All right. In my best David Letterman impression, the third most popular question that generous business owners ask is what, Cale?
Not surprisingly, can you help me with my investments? Now, obviously, there's the question, help me with my investments, and then there's the, well, what does that actually mean? Kind of a la our number 4 question. A lot of times, spouses are not aligned with some semblance of risk, and Jeff kind of alluded to that with one family we were ruminating on that. When it came to risk, do we put it all in the business? Do we diversify out? And then there's how does that diversification look like? Or as we like to say, what are those buckets? And then, what's kind of a new and growing and exciting movement is like, do our values align with our investments? And what does that look like? And how do we make those decisions? And so, not surprisingly, there can be a lot of confusion and disagreement and opportunity, as I like to call them, challenging obstacles for us to overcome comes out of these conversations. And so the principle that goes in with that is what we like to call invest in a full inheritance. And I'll explain what that means in these 5 capitals we talk about in just a minute. But one of the parables that we love here is comes from Matthew 25. I won't read you all the verses, but it's the parable of the talents, right? Which is we're all blessed with something. Some of us, for whatever reason, are blessed with more talents than another. God doesn't care about how many talents you have. What he cares is what you do with them. And we all know what happened to the bad guy that, he got the one and he just held on to it. He didn't do anything with it, right? Didn't produce a good return for the master, for the owner. And that was, kind of condemned, as it were, whereas the people that went out and did something with the gifts and talents that they had for the owner were championed and ultimately rewarded. And with the point being is, hey, because you guys did such a great job, I'm going to take from the one, I'm going to give it to the guys that know what they're doing. So principle there is how do we invest the resources that we have to honor the king and produce a good return, and whatever that means. Not just, we tend to, in our industry, we tend to focus on return as just, percentage return on investment, which is important, but not the only thing we're talking about when we talk about a return. So with that, let me also explain what we mean by invest in a full inheritance. The idea here is there's many things that we will leave behind, not just financial capital, although that's what we tend to focus on the most, especially in the context of an estate plan, like we just mentioned with kingdom versus world. We're going to leave behind money and stuff, but there's other things that you are going to leave behind, and to kind of just qualify those into 5 categories. You've got, of course, financial capital, but you also have relational capital, the people that you know, character capital, the values and virtues that you instill, intellectual capital, the things that you know or the education that you provide, and then spiritual capital, your faith, your wisdom, etc. And all things being equal, a question we like to challenge people with is if you have to bankrupt one of those capitals, which one would you bankrupt? So in other words, your children or whoever you leave an inheritance behind get 4 out of 5 capitals, but not all 5. It's a sobering question because it tends to put in perspective how important is the financial capital in the context of my legacy, and also if I'm if I've been spending an inordinate amount of time on thinking about how to, get that into the hands of the next generation, have I perhaps neglected time or investment into these other capitals that matter just as much, if not more? And how is God calling you to steward that legacy or steward those resources? And if you happen to have some excess financial capital, perhaps could it be oxygen to fuel some of those other capitals, whether that's intellectual, spiritual, whatever the case might be. So it's an interesting thought process, and it puts into perspective how we're stewarding our financial capital to make an impact for the kingdom. What does that look like? How does that impact inheritance and what we leave behind, and the legacy and stewardship of everything that we have? So I'll pause there. Jeff, any reactions or stories?
Well, what I was thinking about while you were describing the full inheritance is, a lot of these questions seem really simple on the face of it, that there's a lot of depth that can be drawn from behind them. So when people just talk about investments, hey, let's kind of get on the same page. Maybe the one spouse is conservative, one's more aggressive, let's just find some common ground. That can be done. Okay. But what you're describing is really a much deeper discussion of, it's not just investments to make more money for ourselves. What are we investing in? These other capitals, how do we use our money to deliver a full inheritance? So even if you don't have $100 million, think about the inheritance you received in those other capitals and what you might deliver that way. I think that's a richer discussion of investments. But at the same time, there's kind of two other angles here. One we've sort of alluded to with getting on the same page about the risk you take with the actual sort of investments that you make, monetary investments, financial investments that you make. And there's also kind of the faith-driven investor movement that's happening. So we're getting, both of those questions about, so Cale, why don't you just give a couple of minutes? I know it's kind of hard to do on each of those deals, but why don't you talk about the wealth languages that you came up with, just a basic framework to help spouses or other family members kind of understand each other a little better when it comes to risk? And then also this faith-driven movement. What are the questions we're getting around that?
Yeah, so on the wealth languages, and we've got, we can send this around if you're interested, just shoot us an email, but we can send you a white paper and stuff like that to read more about it, or even take the assessment. We have a little assessment on it. But it was kind of birthed out of this idea of spouses not being on the same page when it comes to money. And I'm not all that smart, but I remember when I went through marriage counseling or premarital counseling, when I got engaged, we read, like a lot of people, the love languages. And there's nothing, earth-shattering about that book, but it was helpful to at least have a common ground understanding between my spouse and I on, oh, okay, I see, you receive love in words of affirmation. Like, if that's not natural to me, then just knowing it can help me understand, A, put language to what she's feeling that I sometimes don't understand, and B, something practical I can maybe work on, right? So the idea came from that same idea, which is how are we uniquely motivated around wealth or money? And so simplistically, you think about your classic 2x2 that every MBA is built, where you've got, in the top right, you've got kind of, if your X and Y axis are kind of risk and time, top right, you've got, opportunity. People that think further in the future, when they think about extra dollars, they're thinking about how can I opportunistically utilize wealth for something, in the future that's, greater risk. And that could be a, actual investment, or it could be impact, but it's going to be opportunistic in its thinking. The contrary to that, bottom left, if you will, would be stability. The every dollar I get is I need for today, the now, and I don't want to risk it because I want to make sure everyone's got clothes on their back and we've got a house that's hospitable and we're able to have a nice place for, maybe host people or whatever the case might be. Neither one of those are better or worse than the other, but they give a different framework for how we kind of view wealth and the use of it. And then kind of top left are the fun folks. I call them the moment people. They're living for the moment. And these are the people that, if you're not careful, they just buy boats and, break out another 1,000, which is the acronym for boat. But they're also the people that are really good at helping us utilize the resource that God's given us to create memories and experiences and enjoy and all that kind of good things. So all these can have pros and cons, but those are our moment folks. They're think a little more risky but living in the now, so to speak. And then bottom right would be kind of the antithesis of that, would be people that are future oriented, not to stereotype, but most a lot of accountants and engineers tend to fall in this category. But it's thinking about things that have to happen in the future, generally with money, that we need to make sure we're thinking about today. So every dollar today is kind of like goes into a bucket that's something in the future. So it's just a little exercise. If you want to know more about it, again, encourage you to either take the assessment or send an email. We can get you more information. But the idea is to help people understand where people are coming from, a background of thinking about wealth and kind of their intrinsic motivation around that, and maybe start having healthy discussions around what does risk look like because we approach wealth in two different categories. How do we start to allocate accordingly as a family unit rather than just one of us making these decisions? So it's designed to help bring unity. And then the second comment you made, Jeff, around kind of this faith-driven movement, and if you're on this call, there's chances at least half of you, if not more, have heard about it. But it's kind of a growing space where it's how do you align your faith with your investments? It's actually been around for quite some time, but like a lot of things, when it first started, it was like, well, what is this? And, is this just, especially for those of us that have, come from the Christian community, is this just someone, the ex-pastor slapping a cross on the side of a van and saying I should buy it because it's Christian, but it's really not, it's B team. So there's a lot of that, growing up it had to do, but it's been around now for, well, in kind of the traditional sense, it's been around within this kind of faith-driven moniker for maybe around 20 years. But the idea of aligning faith with money is not a new idea. It's been around since the dawn of time. But there's new products that are now available, both in public and private markets. And as a result, there's new potential to do due diligence around those products. Among all the normal due diligence you would do, what's the risk profile and what's the return profile and what's the history and the track record and who are the leaders and yada, yada, yada. There's now another potential due diligence, which is how are you defining faith-driven or faith-aligned? What does that mean? And are you screening things in or screening out? So it's a very exciting space, but it can also be a very confusing space. And so there's opportunity to press into that for those that are called with practical next steps. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about that if anyone has questions about it. But it's an exciting new movement. There are mature, exciting opportunities within that. And it changes the conversation a little bit from pure return on investment in terms of like dollars to, well, what's the return on capital from a spiritual quotient and for a kingdom quotient? And how do we both record that, but also is that something that we want to align our dollars with? So it changes the conversation, and it's exciting and growing space, and we're getting more and more and more questions about it. So something that comes up frequent or more and more frequently in these conversations around these questions. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things being in the middle of that movement that we've realized is people really kind of back to our have a written plan and needing a team. A lot of people really need a team to do that research. It really requires a lot of work to do that and to asset allocate correctly and that sort of thing. So anyway, a simple question about investments can turn into, as you can see, getting on the same page with your spouse. How do you use the money, not just for financial purposes, for a full inheritance? And then how do you use the money really as ministry in the investments you're making? That's also a possibility. So anyway, very deep question, lots to go into there. But we probably ought to keep moving, Cale. So let's go to number 2.
Let's go to number 2.
So the second most popular question we get from generous business owners is what, Cale?
Do I need a DAF, which is a donor advised fund, or a foundation? Common question, and translation of that is really we want to be generous. How do we do that efficiently? What are the vehicles? What are the right tools? How do we maximize our impact? How do we, appropriately take advantage of tax incentives, but not let the tax tail wag the dog? And kind of the principle around this we mentioned earlier is, well, all things being equal, we'd love to disinherit the IRS. We think that's a good game plan. And the verse that we have for this comes from 1 Timothy, which I'm going to pull that up real quick. I didn't have it immediately available. So from chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. My phone will work.
I'll read it.
Oh, go ahead.
Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life.
So a practical application for this one is the exercise we walked y'all through at the very beginning, which is that kingdom versus world exercise. That's a great way to frame up this conversation and make that determining factor ultimately of, is it a DAF or a foundation? But there's usually a lot of discussion about what's the purpose and what are we trying to accomplish before we get there, and how does this fit into the estate plan? And so, Jeff, I know you've got a good story about this.
Well, we've got a bunch of them. I mean, this is number 2 for a reason. You won't be surprised by number 1. I mean, if you're thinking of what it is, you're probably right. But number 2, this is right on its heels because people know that, we have one niche. It's dealing with generous business owners, and and generous is in the word. People know that. So when they come in, they tend to ask giving questions. They have tactical questions. And like I said at the beginning, this is one of the most popular that we get. And when we hear it, especially because we don't often know the people, their whole story, we say, it is a great question, actually, and an important one. Put a pin in it. We'll get back to it. Tell us the whole story. And so as we're hearing the whole story, their heart, what God's telling them to do, kind of answering those big questions. How much enough for you? How much enough for the kids? What do we do with the rest? There's always a generosity desire if they're asking this kind of question. They just want to know how to do it. And they need this sort of written plan, this framework first, and then that'll determine it. So, Cale, you and I were in a meeting not that long ago. And this is, there are some sort of differences between these things. So a donor advised fund, for those that most of you probably have heard of that at least, but the big benefits are it's its own 501c3, so you don't have to do your own filings. So the giving you do out of your donor advised fund, it's almost like a charitable checking account, if you will. I mean, you can invest the money and all of that, but it can be anonymous. You don't have to file your own Form 990 to tell the world where you gave the money or how much is in the account. So it can be anonymous in that way. It's simpler to operate. You can donate appreciated public stocks, private company ownership, real estate, all kinds of things, and get a fair market value for the deduction. Okay. Not available in a foundation in most cases. So this sort of markup, big deduction, anonymity, simplicity. And I think but you have to, the limitation is that all the money that goes out has to go to a 501c3. So you can't have employees in it generally. You can't just write a check for a scholarship to a person directly, that kind of thing. That's what a foundation is for. A foundation is more it's an operating entity. You do file your own taxes. You can hire employees to run the foundation, and you can write those checks to the scholarship recipient or to buy groceries for the food bank or whatever specific thing you want to do. But Cale, remember we had that, you want to talk about that couple that we had in where the husband's really running this business and his wife was like super talented and they asked this question. It was super fun to kind of point out to them these differences and where it might fit for them. That just as a story.
Yeah. So husband, classic kind of entrepreneur, runs like a business was doing close to $1 billion in revenue, and he's got a couple things he's done on the side. And so they're busy, and he's busy, but they're very charitably inclined. And the spouse she's extremely smart, trained CPA. But you don't necessarily know that, when if you just met her for the first time. And so they were asking this question. And so through this conversation and a lot of hearing the story and what their heart is behind it, it became clear. Two things became clear. They wanted to be very hands-on in the things that they donated to. They wanted to be very proactive in getting vision trips kind of organized and people to go see things and kind of partner with these charities that they love to get other people on board as potential donors. They wanted to be able to write those checks to kind of unique individuals. They wanted to hire people maybe within the entity. And the spouse in this case had a very strong desire to kind of run and operate this, because sometimes some of those other things exist, but there's no one that wants to actually do the work, in which case maybe it's the wrong decision to just have the private foundation. But in this case, it made a lot of sense based on what they were trying to do and where God was calling them for them to have that private foundation. Usually what happens is people come in. I would say what's most common is people think they need a private foundation, and then you talk through it, and what they actually need is a DAF. In this case, it was the opposite. They kind of thought, well, I don't think they were sure what they need, but what they ended up needing based on that conversation was a foundation. And honestly, they still have a DAF as well. They go hand in hand. They can work together in many cases. But it was an interesting conversation that really, again, like Jeff said, it's put a pin in it. What's the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? So that narrative drove the structure and the ultimate execution, as opposed to what can often sometimes happen is, you go talk to the attorney, let's just say, hey, we want to be charitably inclined. We got a lot of money. What do we do? And they're like, oh, great. People like you have private foundations. Like, exactly. I can set that up for you tomorrow. And here's how you can use it. And that's extended conversation. And
exactly.
Okay, great. But it might end up being the wrong solution. With a foundation, there's a 5%, that has to get donated each year. Sometimes the money never gets donated all out. And then you've got, we know some people like this, 7th generation family foundation. Some of those are great. Others of those, there's 40, heirs involved in this private foundation that none of them care about. And there's a reason why, United Way or the Red Cross get big donation checks. They're just like, write it to the Red Cross. I don't want to be in this meeting. So people generally don't have that intention when they set up a private foundation, as an example. So that's why the discussion and the purpose is very healthy thing to do to ultimately figure out, well, what's the right vehicle to help you align your wealth with that purpose. So anything else to add, Jeff, or we'll move on to number one?
I think that's, let's go to number one.
All right, here we go. The big
All right.
one.
As you might anticipate, because maybe you've been thinking in your head, what are the 5 top questions I have? Or maybe you got 1 or 2. But boy, oh boy, just about anybody with children or grandchildren asked this question. And number 1 most asked question by generous business owners is, Cale,
how do I give my kids a leg up? Or translation, how do I not ruin my kids with money?
Or as I like to say, how do I give my kids a leg up, but not 2 legs up on the couch?
That's right. And the verse we've got with this is, and I won't read the whole thing, but it comes from Luke 15, which is the parable of the prodigal son. The principle here is empower, don't control. A lot of it, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but a lot of the answering to this question from a legal standpoint comes from, we'll dump the money into a trust and we'll put a lot of control mechanisms on there that will ensure or prohibit your child from doing things that you don't agree or align with. And by the way, that can be a great tactical way to do this. And for some families, that is the right outcome, but it doesn't have to be. It's not the only way to do it. And so we think the story of the prodigal son is an interesting one, because in the story of the prodigal son, the off the reservation kid marches into dad and says, I want my inheritance. And dad gives it to him. No strings attached. Here's what's yours. And we all know the story. It does not go well for said child. He screws it up royally and wastes and depletes every dollar, so we're told. And ultimately, at the end, of course, we know the feel good story is that son coming back and the father being so excited when he does. So this this particular father in the story didn't control his child. It led to a bad outcome in the immediate side, but ultimately ended up in a good outcome. And it's an interesting thing to talk about, which is, well, how do we not control our children to be grateful if, heaven forbid, they're off the reservation, and be grateful when they return of their own accord, but be thoughtful about even stewarding the deployment of assets to the next generation. How do we do that where we can be hopeful for them and empower them, but not necessarily control them? So we've got a ton of stories about this. But Jeff, I'll kick it back to you maybe for just a first thought to an application here.
Yeah, I mean, there's there's so much you can do here, and this is definitely one of those things where, really what we're trying to do here in this whole webinar is kind of answer the question for you: what are other people like me doing? And so a lot of I really love this as a principle of this empowerment, don't control. I mean, that parable, is so great because it shows how God looks at us. He's generous to us. He gives us free will. But my inclination as a father is to control the behavior of my kids, even though I know I don't like being controlled. My tendency is to control. So I love this idea as a general concept. Use that as a filter for what you're doing. Are you trying to control them now by, all the little rules in the trust while you're alive or while they're dead? We would argue more toward the freedom side. So there are all kinds of examples here. One of them is a lot of the things that we've seen over time is not creating dependency, empowering the kids to, go for, use the money to get them an education, this sort of thing. That's sort of the new family farm, if you will. If you're not a farmer, how do they make a living? You used to give them the farm. Now maybe it's education. So that they learn and can provide for themselves. So you spend the money on education, and then now everybody's different. But one thing that we've seen that's been really helpful is people give unpredictable chunks. They'll tell them, they want to create dependency where there's a certain amount coming every year. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that if they're prepared, but something we see a lot of folks do is, if people are young folks or can't afford a house or something, they give them a little bit of cash to help them get into a house in a better neighborhood or something like that, so the kids can go to a better school, or maybe they will pay for education for a private school or a private Christian school or whatever they're called to do. But these things are kind of finite, and they don't create dependency, and so. We've seen that as a popular practice. Cale, why don't you tell the story about because a lot of this, a lot of these 5 questions and principles intertwine.
Yeah.
So there's also, the 5 capitals that you also already kind of took us through.
Yeah.
How does that play in? And maybe talk about the blessing letter a little bit.
Yeah. So 2 things I'll mention here, and maybe before I jump into the 5 capitals, even I was thinking, you made a good point on a kind of the distribution, if you will. I mean, one of the things that was unique about again, for those of you that were at the David Green thing, the way he, we heard the story about him kind of, he did the normal estate plan, got it all to the kids, and then had to go get it all back. And it is a radical and miraculous story. But one of the things that made it maybe a little more palatable, no less radical, but a little more palatable, is he had not paid distributions so there was no one dependent on those funds coming in. And by the way, if you're listening, maybe you're like, uh-oh, too late. You know,
Too late. Yeah.
we have plenty, we know plenty of people that are in that category. In fact, most people are probably in that category. But that, I think, was unique to the Greens, is they had not created that dependency. So if you're listening, you're younger, you know, their kids aren't that old or whatever the case might be. Maybe I don't want to suggest you need to do what they did, but if that speaks to you, something to consider is you know, should we or should we not create dependency on some sort of distribution? But even if that's, you know, cat's out of the bag too late, that's why I go back to I think the five capitals are so critical, because it starts an opportunity for us to communicate. And I think that's one of the most important things around how do I, you know, answer this question, is communication, and around, you know, whatever the stated purpose is, whatever the plan is, at appropriate times is so critical. And when you can connect the dots and empower your children with, you know, decisions you're making or not making, and the why behind it, and connect it to, you know, either dangers or opportunities, that's a really, really important thing. So, you know, the Barnharts that you mentioned, Jeff, right? I mean, they started talking to their kids at a young age about, hey, our family's about generosity. I mean, they went on a gazillion mission trips as young kids. If you talk to Barnhart's kids that are now all in their, you know, 30s and 40s, they'll tell you about it. You know, growing up, they never thought about inheritance from I'm going to get a bunch of money standpoint. From a very young age, it was ingrained in them that, like, my part of my legacy is or inheritance is this continuation of this generosity that I've gotten to partake in, and they were exposed to and kind of trained up in from a very young age. So you know, the Barnharts kind of invested in that, you know, spiritual capital, that relational capital, that intellectual capital, that character capital of who you are as a Barnhart, what we do, how we do it, spiritually, why that aligns with where God's calling us to be. And so I think the more you can kind of communicate decisions and frame them up with why, the better. What we do know statistically is the families that don't communicate about it, and it just happens without any sort of rhyme or reason, regardless of what the plan is, tends to go pretty poorly in the long run, regardless of what the intent was. So that would be my biggest suggestion, is communication. And one of the exercises Jeff alluded to that we think is a great, easy way to get started is to kind of look back at the Old Testament. You know, back in the day, people would write, there would be a blessing. You know, whenever there was a time for a kid to receive their inheritance, they would sit them down and do this whole, you know, blessing to them. It was clearly very important in the olden days. So we like the idea of writing out what we call a blessing letter to your kids. And this can be done with or without a discussion about inheritance, but certainly should always be, whether you communicate it now or wait, attached to, in some way, shape, or form, your estate plan or your will. And the idea here is when, God forbid, something happens to you, and here come, you know, the executor or the attorney, whoever it is, it's going to, hey, kids, you know, mom and dad are gone. Here's what's happening. Would you rather have them hear that from them, or would you rather have them hear it from you? Because they're going to hear it from somebody. And if they hear it from you, is it really about the money, or is it about something else? And so we like the idea of writing a letter of blessing, of just telling your kids, you know, why you love them, what sticks out to you unique about their lives, what you see God doing in their lives. Obviously, this can be updated over the years. And then if you want to include anything about, here's what we've decided to do with our wealth and why, what a gift that is, that they actually get your words. We love the idea of speaking that to them, like face to face at some point. You know, heaven forbid you might not get that chance. That's why we say attach it to the estate plan. You know, worst case scenario, if it's maybe not age appropriate yet to do so. But it's been a very effective tool and a great exercise to just start that communication process with your children of kind of letting them know about these five capitals, how you're attempting to invest in them and steward the gift that God's given you, and how you would hope they might also step into that stewardship in whatever unique way God has gifted them. So So that's just a little exercise on how we communicate with clients on helping them answer this question. Jeff, anything you would add there, or we'll move into? I know we're
No, I
probably
think
at Q&A time.
I think we're into Q&A time, and just to kind of put a bow on what we've talked about, the purpose here of this webinar is really to kind of help you think about how to connect your money with your purpose. And so what we ran you through is those three key questions to ask God and talk about with your spouse if you're married, of how much is enough for you, how much is enough for the kids, and what should you do with the rest. So that's kind of your homework, if you will. Secondly, what we tried to do is give you a framework, sort of a kingdom versus world estate plan, to sort of acknowledge if you're in the sort of world's estate plan, you're not alone. You're in the vast majority. If it's just, you were given the advice to divide your net worth by the number of kids and grandkids you have, you're not alone. That's how it's done. And if you've got some discomfort, think about a kingdom plan. So if God gives you a finish line and there's excess, what should you do with it? Think about those things. We're available to talk to you about those things. Jeff.thomas@arcosglobal.com or Cale.Dowell@arcosglobal.com. Happy to chat with you more about it. But that's all we're trying to do is give you kind of some, the big question we get is, what are other people like me doing? So we know you want to connect your money with your purpose, but you tend to have these practical questions. So we try to also address those practical questions. And what are other people like you doing about those questions? We try to give you a little bit of some biblical principles and some tips about what other folks are doing. So with that, Cale, you want to kind of open it up for questions? Feel free to, put something in the chat with a question. And we've got, I think, Monica on hand to sort of field those questions.
That's right. So Monica, maybe, just for the sake of time, we promised we'd be done by 11 or whatever time. So you're in basically 10 minutes. So maybe just one or two questions and we'll close it down. No one ever gets mad about ending early. So Monica, if any questions, feel free to ask them.
Sure. A few questions came in in the Q&A. So the first question that came in was, for the estate plan, are there any examples of people not giving away their business or maybe keeping the business within the family without creating a sale?
Well, maybe I'll take that one. Yes. And we tried to reference that. I know in our sort of kingdom version of the estate plan, we're sort of like, okay, everything over the thing, over what you're going to keep, give it away. A lot of times that's the business, if you will. So, our friend Alan Barnhart that we've referenced many times, he's basically got a trust that we can kind of run you through that structure. We kind of call it the Barnhart structure, where you do give it all away. There's basically a committee that has the voting interest, so you still can maintain running the business and reinvesting and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, similar to
Go
how
ahead,
the Greens.
Cale.
I was going to say, yeah, that's similar to how the Greens have done it, just to make that connection there.
Yeah. Okay. And then but if you're not going to try to give it all away, let's call that the Barnhart model. Let's call it the Oaks model. And that's more of this sort of purpose trust where you can still avoid the estate tax and you can have different constituents in it. You can have employees own some of the company stock. You can have outside investors own some of the stock. You can have family members own some, and you can have a foundation or a donor advised fund. So you can have different constituents, but still avoid the taxes. Now, there are other simpler things that the world provides, and if you can always sell the business to purely family members, and you can gift part of it. And you can do, you can do bits and pieces of all those, but there's only so many things you can do with a business, right? You can essentially sell it to a third party, whether that's family or an outside group or a combination. You can donate it. But there's only so many things you can do. Okay. So if you want to do a combination, there's various ways to skin that cat. You can do an ESOP where you sell it all to the employees. You can sell it all to a third party, a strategic or a private equity firm, or a combination of those amounts. So we're not trying to prescribe that you give every nickel away over maybe that finish line number, or some of that finish line number needs to be in ownership of the company. We just want to open you up to the idea that maybe some of it might be charitable. Maybe that's just 10%, or maybe it's 90%. We're not prescribing that. There's a structure for whatever you want to do. We just want to open your mind to those ideas. How would you jump off on that, Cale?
No, I think that's a great answer, and I think the point there is, this is why we're keen on the narrative, is if you can, in layman's terms, to start to, and by the way, oftentimes that takes discussion, especially with your spouse and maybe trusted people that have experience, or other peers that you have that have navigated similar things. But what's the narrative of what you're trying to accomplish in the most layman's terms possible? Like, in a perfect world, wave your magic wand, what would happen? And then, oftentimes there's a way to make that happen, and it can be custom. But what we see happen often is, I don't kind of know what I want. So I go to the, insert estate planner or whoever it is, and they're just like, oh, okay, well, here's what the world does. And sounds reasonable, and that's what gets executed. And maybe that's the right outcome, but oftentimes we meet people where that's not the right outcome. And once it's done, especially if there's things that have been done that are irrevocable, it gets harder to undo. So that's why we're keen on kind of having that narrative discussion of what you're attempting to do, and start dreaming about what that might look like, and then find the right people that can help execute. They understand what you're trying to do. They're in alignment with it. Because we've had those conversations too, where someone like the Barnharts, I mean, they just want to give they want to give every dollar away, and we've seen them walk into an estate planning's office, and the estate planning's like, you want to do what? I mean, they're confused and almost antagonistic to the idea, because maybe they have never seen that before. So it's important to have the right people around you navigate that narrative and ultimately help you execute. So my 2 cents there. All right, Monica, maybe time for one more question.
So let's see here. For faith-driven investments, it can be very confusing. Do you have a way to recommend how to do the due diligence part, or just a simple way to get started?
You want to take that one and talk about kind of, there's other questions I got to answer before they get there.
Yeah. Man, there's so much I can talk about here. So I guess maybe just my initial reaction is yes, I hear you. It is confusing.
Yeah.
Even for professionals, it can be confusing. So I just want to acknowledge that, but I also want to say that it can be a great space. Like, it is a growing and exciting and maturing space, and there are wonderful, amazing, both gifted and talented and experienced individuals, but also people that are desiring to have kingdom impact and actually have a unique process to do that at various different ways. So I just want to acknowledge that it can be confusing. In terms of due diligence, I hate to say it this way, but it's hard to do it on your own in isolation. It's hard enough for people to have a due diligence process, just, when oftentimes what happens inside of small family offices is, they just get lob deals, and you're just doing due diligence on, well, what's the, what I'm looking at from a return standpoint, who are the managers, yada, yada, yada. So not only is there that, but now there's the added element, which I won't go too far in the weeds here, of like, well, how are you defining what's faith-driven, what's not faith-driven? Are you, some of these groups, they're screening things out, they're saying, probably the most common is, there's some funds that have actually been around for, 20 plus years. Guidestone, as an example, they offer some public funds that are largely, I think originally crafted for kind of the Catholic Church. Well, it screens out, alcohol and things that are pro-choice and some other, kind of initiatives. So on the positive side, you can actually read a prospectus and kind of get a sense for what it is, what their modus operandi is, of sorts of how they're aiming, just like they would on the investment standpoint, how they're aiming to be allocated, how they're aiming to be faith-driven. But it's not always so clear, because then you get into the weeds of, okay, well, what do you mean by you're screening out alcohol? And it will, do you care about, is that one of your particular proclivities that you care about? And then if it is, well, to what level of depth or subjectivity or materiality do you care about that? Because is it just someone profiting off the sale of alcohol? Or what about Costco? They, profit off the distribution of alcohol. So you can imagine how confusing this can get. And then on top of that, now layer in what's often the more exciting opportunities within the faith-driven movement, which is the private side, the alternatives. So there's people out there doing incredible things, promising zero return. They have a for-profit wrapper for the sole purpose of getting dollars into areas that would otherwise be hard to get into. How do you navigate that versus the people that are looking at, let's call it they're trying to keep up with normal market-adjusted returns. So there's a lot of confusion and things to navigate. So on the due diligence question, my only answer for you is hard to do on your own. The second part of that question is where to get started. What we see often is this continuum between what I call inspiration and ultimate outcome. Usually what happens is someone goes, they learn about faith-driven investments somewhere. Maybe it was a faith-driven investor conference or something for the first time. And all those guys are really good friends of ours. But they get that moment of inspiration of like, I've never thought about that. I could actually align my capital for something that's actually aiming to have a kingdom impact. It's exciting. So the inspiration rise, but then the outcome is something extreme. It's every dollar is going to be that way. And which is, if that's the outcome you want and you can capable of making that jump, fantastic. Most people are not. It's not that immediate, not that extreme or immediate, and they don't know where to start. So what we suggest is, and what we've actually done within the business, is we've created like easy ways to get started. So for example, we've got a public kind of portfolio we created that is really simple. We're applying our same due diligence process we would apply on non-faith aligned investments to some faith aligned funds. And the only thing that we're kind of screening for is, are they attempting to do something faith aligned? Are they holding themselves out to be a faith aligned fund? And then does it also match all these other characteristics that we would look for in non-faith aligned investments? And if so, it fits in this portfolio and the appropriate asset allocation, and off we go. Easy way to get started is just to, buy something like that where the work's been done. It's whetting the appetite. It gets you accustomed to the idea. It's still aimed after good returns. And maybe from there, you maybe move into something that's a little more on the fringe, or a little more, it's not focused on great returns. It's focused on, more exceeding impact.
Well, you could talk about the private side.
And so that's where I was going to go, is the private side's another example of that, which is we've got kind of an allocation we've crafted at different, levels of net worth. Maybe you've got $10 million, you're going to put $1 million into some faith aligned alternatives. And, you might asset out, we might asset allocate that across, 4 or 5 different deals. So things that are, for the kingdom, they're making a kingdom impact, and they're making, productive and positive returns. So I would argue an easy way to get started. It's kind of like someone that's on a journey of generosity. It's like the first dollar is the most important. Giving away the first dollar builds the habit. So, taking the first step into just something simple that's, you understand, it's not too outside the bounds of what is an easy way to get started. And maybe over time, God calls you to be even more impactful with your dollars. And there's lots of ways to do that. And we are very familiar with all the different organizations out there that are doing some cool stuff, some of which, again, are promising no returns. But we don't think that's a great place to get started if you've never done anything like it, unless God's put a strong conviction on your heart. So that would be my recommendation there, is keep it simple. Going too far in the weeds is what happens to a lot of people, is it's like paralysis by analysis. So, having somebody to help you think through this and do due diligence is critical. And then having a simple way to start in an easy entree, and then maybe you build over time. Those are kind of 2 things I would say are a great place to get started. Anything you would add, Jeff?
No, I think we're up against time, and we could do a whole webinar on that. Maybe we should. So we'll leave it at that. We just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we hope this has been helpful as you're on the journey to connect your money with your purpose. As I said, email either one of us, jeff.thomas or cale.dowell at arcosglobal.com, and we're happy to get you more resources. Thanks, everybody.
Blessings.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.